I cut some more spruce down to make some columns that will later support the doors for the extension. These were glued and screwed onto the frame. I could then add cladding to form some front panels. I wanted one single piece of cladding to run the full length of the extension right at the top. I measured and cut to length one of the cladding pieces. I could then offer it up and mark up the position of where the doors will be onto it. I marked a pencil line where I wanted to remove material and then cut it away with the jigsaw. I cleaned up the jigsaw cuts with a block plane just to get them straightened up. Next I needed to rip off some of the top of it in order for it to fit in place underneath the roof. And I was going to do that on the table saw, but then I realised that wasn't possible as it couldn't go against the fence due to the shape of the workpiece. With hindsight I should have made this cut first, but it was too late for that, so I marked up what I needed to remove and ripped it using the circular saw instead. That slotted in place nicely, so I secured it with screws at each end, and in the middle I cut a couple of filler blocks so that I could secure it in the centre too. Now that the columns were fitted at the front, the OSB floor sheet could no longer fit around them, and I couldn't remove this piece of OSB either, so I needed to cut it while it was in place. The oscillating tool was perfect for this job. I just cut a couple of notches away and it was problem solved. And then I could screw it down. Next I started insulating. I am mainly doing this to cut down the noise as there'll be an air compressor and dust extractor inside. This stuff is rock wool sound insulation slabs. I bought 2 of these packs on eBay for £52 and there was 9 slabs in each pack. I actually could have gotten away with just 1 pack, but I thought I might want to double it up in some areas. I used an old handsaw to cut it to size and that worked well. This is quite nasty stuff, so I wore gloves and probably should have been wearing a respirator too. I added it to the walls, the roof, and underneath the floor too. I used an old salvaged piece of chipboard as a bottom panel underneath the floor just to make sure that the insulation won't fall out. This required some acrobatics. At this point Dylan came by to inspect my work. I mentioned in the intro to the last video that I wasn't entirely sure that the workshop wall would be able to take this much weight, so at this point I decided to do a sitting test. I wasn't quite confident enough to do a Matthias Wandel style jump test, so this will have to do. I had a leftover piece of plasterboard, so I used that to secure the insulation to the roof. I secured it with screws in the middle and cut some blocks of wood to use as cleats to secure it at the sides. Next I needed to finish off the cladding. I had just left the awkward bits until last. I measured the angle of the roof with a bevel gauge and that allowed me to mark up the final cladding pieces for the side panels. The first just needed a small corner removed, which I did on the bandsaw. And the final piece was cut in the same way at the bandsaw. Next I ripped a piece of cladding at the table saw to 18mm square to create some corner posts. These will hide the end grain of the cladding pieces. I also ripped a small 45-degree bevel on the corner just to make it easier to nail them in place. Next I started working on the doors. I first ripped a couple of battens at the table saw. I measured and marked up where I wanted the battens to be on the door in relation to where the floor was, as I wanted the bottom batten on the door to close onto the top of the floor, if that makes sense. I marked up the screw positions and then added screws through the cladding and into the battens from underneath. Then I added another batten at the top and I used a clamp just to hold the cladding pieces tightly together. In between the battens I could add more insulation. I then offered up the door to check it would fit, and it was slightly too big in some areas, so I marked up the high spots with a pencil and used my electric planer to straighten those out. I fitted the doors using these galvanised hinges and some of these security screws to ensure that no unwanted visitors armed with a screwdriver would be able to get into it. Next I added an old piece of hardboard to the inside of the door. This was glued and screwed to the battens and would hold the insulation in place. I'm just using scrap materials here. As you can probably tell, I'm not really concerned what the inside of the shed looks like. It really doesn't matter to me. I made the second door in exactly the same way as the first, but this one needed to be ripped down to the right width. So after measuring, I could cut a couple of centimetres off the width of the door with my circular saw and then fitted it in the same way as the first door. And I designed the doors so that I retained the tongue and groove overlap where the doors close onto one another so that there is no gap in between them. I chiselled away some of the insulation from the inside of the door so that I could add a block of spruce, which I could then mount a door latch onto. I ran out of security screws at this point, so I'll replace the screws that I'm using here later on. And I bought a padlock too to keep it secure. In future I'll also extend my workshop alarm system to cover the extension too. That's the extension done and I'm pleased with how it turned out. It's a lot more rigid than I expected it to be and I don't have any major concerns about the weight anymore. I knew that the extension itself would be plenty secure enough anyway, just from the fixings to the existing workshop wall, but what I was more concerned about was whether the wall itself could take the weight. That could have been pretty interesting if the wall had come away from the rest of the workshop frame. But the workshop frame was bolted together at the corners anyway, so I think it'll be fine. There is one thing that I would do differently if I was to do this project again, and that would be to make sure that the cladding on the extension lined up with the cladding of the workshop. That was something that hadn't occurred to me until I'd already added the cladding. Later on, when I have some more sheet materials available, I will probably line the inside walls just to hide the insulation. But there's no rush for that. The main thing for me was just to get the extension up and running. And just a final thought, I might also use the space underneath the shed extension as somewhere to store additional timber, because it's going to be dry under there and with good air circulation, and I could space the boards out similarly to how I've done behind me, with small spaces in between each board just to help the airflow. There will be some follow-up videos to this one talking about my new dust collection system and how I'm planning to install it, but I thought I'd keep that as a separate video because it's probably not something that everybody's going to be interested in. So that's it for now. Thanks for watching, and a big thanks to all of my patrons over on Patreon.